And I'm going to be falling back on case studies as illustrative of some of the difficulties. My organization was present in Bosnia before the fighting started. And the reason we were present there was because we had one of those rare operational insights where we felt that, one, the war was going to break out, and two, having done enough by way of operations, we realized that unless we positioned ourselves strategically within the various geographic sectors, we were never going to be able to run logistics programs, et cetera, et cetera. So we did an assessment, as it were, going from one part of the country to the other, and we settled upon working in 3 areas. We had an office in Belgrade, we had an office in office in Sarajevo, in Mostar, and Split, where all the UN convoy routes ran from. So far, so good. Our staff was international. We had people from Australia, from Germany, from the US, from obviously a lot of local staff, but it was very much a mixed collection of the world's population that had interest in what was going on in that part of the world and was determined to do what it could to alleviate the situations which were rapidly emerging. Over time, I noticed an interesting thing beginning to happen. I spent a lot of my time there, even though, and this gets to another point I'll make later, ostensibly I was the director of operations based in New York, but my view of directing operations was not a top-down approach, but rather, let's say, having it both ways. Having the influence at headquarters, but having the presence in the field, and being the sort of interface between the field workers and headquarters, because I shared the field workers' perception of headquarters as being somewhat remote from reality. And headquarters I was able to convince because, I should say one thing, I'd entered this career rather older than most of my colleagues, and they didn't quite know how to take me, so I had a little more leverage simply by looking more mature. In any case, I began to notice over a period of time that even the people who were doing the work were becoming clientized. It was very difficult to get through checkpoints, to have common meetings, but at one point we were able to find a location off Split in the Adriatic, and we had a meeting, and I suddenly became aware of the fact that the people who were working in Mostar were resentful of the people working in Belgrade, on the Serbian side, not necessarily in Belgrade, but on the Serbian side of the conflict. And the people working in Zagreb were resentful of the people working in Mostar. And this wasn't an ethnic thing, because they represented a variety of nationalities. This was the reality of trying to be neutral when you were seeing a war from the perspective of a location. They became part of that view. Increasingly. There was a lot of turnover. As the war dragged on, and again, some of you may have heard the term humanitarian fig leaf, we became keenly aware rather, that the duration of the war in some way was almost a consequence of the fact that we were effectively running convoy routes, and et cetera, and that we were reducing the impact, morbidity, and mortality by our actions, and that the politicians had the luxury of negotiating and negotiating and negotiating. And I think, as a subtext, we all concluded that they were just hoping that everyone would get tired of fighting. In fact, something very similar happened to that during the Dayton Accords. But from the point of view of the field workers, it was exhausting to realize that being neutral didn't mean very much. You would go through a checkpoint. On one side, you were applauded. On the other side, you were stoned. Neutrality was in your mind, not in the mind and eyes of the beholder. It's difficult to maintain a posture for very long that way. Impartiality. There's a tricky thing. Humanitarian workers will provide aid to anyone who's not carrying a gun. Okay, easily said, harder to do. You know that, for example, during a particular situation in a famine, you'll be distributing food to a family, and you know very well that that family is going to be sharing food with the guy who's sitting in the bush with the gun. You know this. Do you deal with the information that you know in exactly the way you do in terms of making categorical behavior? Of course not. You deal with what you see in front of you to the best of your ability, because that's what you see in front of you. The long-term implications, sometimes you shut out from your mind. And for a long time, I think, we were fairly successful in doing that. But then sooner or later, these things come crashing down. And the notion of conditionality as to operational behavior becomes more and more significant. It began to emerge, I think, for us, at least from the NGO side, and at this point I was still with the NGOs, during the Bosnian conflict, when more and more I would hear my staff, and perhaps echoes in my own mind, saying things like, are there any good guys in this fight? Isn't everyone doing the things that we feel are, irredeemably inappropriate? That question became harder and harder to answer. But we weren't willing, as humanitarians, because we were dedicated to what some would call an illusion, that the most essential condition of human behavior is empathy. Empathy in terms of understanding the needs and reacting to the needs of others. We were dedicated to that proposition, so it was very difficult to begin to qualify your behavior in terms of what you knew, or what you thought you knew. So you kept on soldiering on, if you will, doing all of these good things in the right way. But sooner or later, I think, I should add as a codicil to what I'm saying, is that there were human rights organizations, and we tried to steer well clear of them for two reasons. One, security. In certain parts of Africa, for example, if the sense was that you were involved with any human rights evaluation of whatever was going on, you were in trouble. And the thing that was your protection, since you didn't have any guns or body armor, was neutrality, and the fact that, okay, you were acceptable because you really weren't a threat to anyone. But if you were associated in any way with the notion of human rights, you became a threat to someone, and therefore your vulnerability and your security began to evaporate very quickly. But the vulnerability began to be less relevant, and the security began to evaporate, to rephrase that. But in any case, so we struggled through Bosnia, and then came Rwanda. And in this manner of speaking, it became an absolute ground zero for the whole notion of conditionality. After the genocide, we were working in the camps in Zaire, in Goma, and several things are happening there. One, from a medical side, I think it was probably one of the most serious cholera outbreaks, at least in modern history. I mean, the mortality rates per thousand were staggering. People were dying by the thousands, and even though there were dozens and dozens of agencies involved, the humanitarian community did a lousy job in dealing with that whole epidemic for a variety of reasons. Some were objectively valid: insufficiency of water, inability to dig latrines because it was a lava-based area, so defecation fields were the norm. But we failed because we were not expert enough, because we were not coordinated enough, and because we simply didn't know what we were doing in the face of such an overwhelming calamity following a genocide. The other thing that was happening was that the camp was controlled by the genocideers, the Hutu militia, remnants of the Hutu army. People were really being treated as if they were in a concentration camp. And in effect, we were assisting the jailers simply by working in that environment. And at one point, the agencies, ours, MSF, and many, many others, got together and said that we are going to come up with a proclamation to encourage, the objective of which was to encourage the UN to recognize the fact that this was a human rights situation which was intolerable, and that the UN had to provide military support to quell the genocideers and control what was happening in the camp. Some 13 or 14 NGOs signed on to this proclamation, and the idea initially was to publish it worldwide. Now we come to the question of methodology and organizational structure, something with which I'm sure you're all familiar. Organizations exist in order to survive, arguably, in addition to their existence for their business purposes or other purposes. But what happened to our proclamation? It never got circulated worldwide because many of the leaders of the organizations began to feel that they were venturing into political waters and that they could not afford the very visible reaction that the press, considering that a lot of the members of the boards especially were people in very high positions in a lot of varying countries. The threat in the proclamation was that unless the UN acted, we would withdraw as agencies, which would have been disastrous for a situation in a camp where hundreds of thousands of people. The proclamation was never issued. My agency withdrew because we simply could not sustain sending young people, young professionals, anyone into that environment anymore. And I'll get back to why that applied to my agency in particular at the time. So we withdrew. I remember MSF France withdrew, and we were the only two. The others soldiered on. We knew at the same time, because we'd had conversations with the UN, that the UN, consistent with its mandate, was going to do what it had to do. It replaced us, because their responsibility was the lives of the hundreds of thousands of people in the camp. So in short, the humanitarian system had organizations whose mandate and imperatives were forcing them to behave in a moral and human way, and the UN system whose mandates and imperative were forcing them to be consistent with their charter. It all makes eminent sense, but arguably, emotionally, it's the sort of sense which is difficult for workers in the field to quite comprehend. Before I move on, the reason that we withdrew was that my particular organization had been founded before World War II. And it was founded on one premise, that freedom, struggle against totalitarian behavior was the ultimate imperative, and that anything that reflected the suppression of people in that manner was not to be accepted. And that was the foundation of the organization. During the war, it was the organization which ran escape routes from the Gestapo, etc., all throughout Europe. And the people who led it had the sort of charisma and character and certainly credibility that moved everyone who worked for the organization. And so we were being consistent with a model that, fortunately for us, was singular. But again, getting back to the very patchwork nature of the humanitarian system, that was one model. There were others. There were religious models. There were simply